Okay, so I am going to read my paper. It's a work in progress and an article that is hopefully will come out at some point. So I appreciate the opportunity and welcome any feedback and questions. I'll get started. So this is the outline. Aware of the dual nature of Heracles, both a mortal hero and a god, ancient Greek writers puzzled over the ultimate origins of this figure. Already Homer toys with the apparent contradiction when Odysseus sees Heracles in the underworld, clarifying that it was a phantom, eidolon, as the divine Heracles enjoys life on Olympus. Later on, Herodotus and other historians map a cultural division onto this dual nature, postulating that while there was a Greek hero, the son of Alcmene, the divine Heracles was a much older Egyptian god. Nonetheless, when Herodotus searches for more information about this Egyptian Heracles, he turned to the Phoenician cultural sphere. So why is that? In this talk, I explore the idea that this move can only be explained by the identification between Heracles and Phoenician Melkart. What is more, it provides a perfect example of the entanglement between Phoenician and Egyptian cultures and religions. Both in the material record and in historical accounts, the Phoenicians appear as key vectors of the reception of Egyptian and other Near Eastern traits into the Greek world. That there's been a lot written about that, of course, but in this talk, I focus on a so far more neglected aspect of these cross-cultural dynamics, how archaic representations of the gods in iconography not only reflect the entanglements between Greeks, Egyptians, and Phoenicians, but likely affected the discourse we have received about Phoenician religion and culture as a vector of reception. My key argument is that the Egyptianizing mode of Phoenician art in the archaic period reinforced the belief that the most renowned Phoenician male god, Melkart, was connected with and ultimately hailed from Egypt. The images I have in mind that I will keep returning to include stone statues found in the Phoenician mainland, Cyprus and Sicily, as well as ivory reliefs and bronze statuettes that circulated throughout the Mediterranean. As a contrasting and confirming case, I discuss the narrative surrounding Aphrodite's Near Eastern origins, which Herodotus ties to the realms of Syria, Palestine, and Cyprus, also entangled with Phoenician culture. This association reflects a well-known overlap in attributes and iconography between Aphrodite and Levantine love and fertility goddesses, especially Phoenician Astarte. These ties were possibly reinforced by similarities between Levantine representations of female goddesses and the Greek female figures of Orientalizing style that visitors encountered in Greek cultic areas, even during classical times and later. In short, I argue that the aesthetics of statues and religious artifacts interacted with ancient ideas of cultural affiliations, religious assimilations, and origins of cults and gods, in this case revealing a Phoenician vector in the history of Heracles and Aphrodite. First, I will offer some background for the Egyptian inflection of Phoenician art, which also modulates Greek adaptations. And then I get into the issue of the Egyptian Heracles. So this was about the female figures. If any label is attached to Phoenician art in the scholarship, is that of of eclecticism, right? Eclecticism is an elastic term that refers in terms of styles or practices to the informed process of selecting from a variety of influences or options to create a new whole. Like all such cultural phenomena, the interpretation of Phoenician eclecticism can have double-sided ramifications. On the one hand, Phoenician eclecticism has invited interpretations of Phoenician culture as unoriginal and derivative, and even to questioning if there is a Phoenician art at all. But nuanced readings of Phoenician art have noted its capacity to synthesize various styles in original and highly characteristic ways, transforming over time to align with international or regional trends, such as the Phoenician adaptation of Greek features during the Persian and Hellenistic periods later on. In other words, there is a meaningful eclecticism in Phoenician art tied to specific cultural trajectories and historical contexts. At the same time, I argue that the eclectic appearance and especially the strong Egyptian inflection of Phoenician religious representations would have invited impressions of derivation, especially in the period when the Greeks came into contact with it during the, say, 7th, 6th centuries BCE. So Phoenician art and culture walked the line between conservatism and openness to adaptation of new elements, depending on where and when we look. To offer some background, Phoenician speakers branched out of the Canaanite continuum at the turn of the 1st millennium BC. Canaanite gods such as Baal and Astarte dominate Phoenician religion throughout the diaspora for the entire 1st millennium, with extraordinary continuities in mythology and ritual. Canaanite culture itself was heavily inflected by Egyptian, Syrian, and Mesopotamian traits, but the Egyptian influence is particularly prevalent in Canaanite culture. The trend was strong since the 2nd millennium BCE, when the kings of Hatzor and Megiddo adopted elements of Egyptian elite culture and royal symbols, and the monarchs of Byblos even wrote their names in Egyptian hieroglyphs. The Egyptian imprint in Phoenician culture continues to be evident throughout the 1st millennium, from the tradition of anthropoi sarcophagi to symbols engraved in funerary and body stelae, to amulets and other sorts of modes of both elite and popular expression. But in turn, after 900 BC, the Phoenicians extended their harbors and homes across the Mediterranean, and their synthesis of Near Eastern traditions was exported, becoming a point of reference for local communities from the Aegean to Italy, Iberia, and Sardinia. From this process emerged what we have come to know as Orientalizing art, a vague and by all means inadequate term for the selective adaptation of technological, artistic, and other cultural traits which engage the wider Eastern Mediterranean. So I argue that the external perception of Phoenician culture as hybrid or eclectic is not merely a modern one, but one possibly prevalent among the Greeks and others in the ancient Mediterranean, affecting their interpretations of Phoenician culture and religion. Unfortunately, our access to the Phoenicians' own views is scanty at best. Hence, our knowledge of their culture is mediated by the image presented by Greeks and others. There's no way of escaping that. Those more familiar with Phoenician culture back then would have seen their artistic expressions as simply Canaanite or Phoenician, regardless of the various elements it contained. But it is also easy to imagine that external observers already in antiquity may have drawn connections similar to those drawn by modern scholars when they interpreted the appearance of Phoenician gods and religious images. So next, I discuss the type of iconography on which my argument depends. Again, the Egyptian hieratic figure, often in smiting, striding position, deployed to represent Phoenician gods, especially Baal or Melkart. This iconography reflects a cultural affinity with Egyptian culture, already expressed in the earlier Canaanite art, but it also provides a Phoenician-Egyptian visual link on which the Greeks could have mapped perceptions of Melkart as Egyptian. As I said, Phoenician religious imagery was anchored in the Canaanite mythologies of Baal and Astarte and their hypostases. Both gods were bringers of life and prosperity and protection in the afterlife, and they were the objects of votive offerings and dedications along with other gods. When written guidance from inscriptions is absent, which is often the case, Identifications of the particular gods in the extant iconography can be difficult. As far as we can tell, the figure of the smiting god could be used for Reshef, kind of a war pestilence god, or for a generic Baal, or for his historical hypostasis, such as Syrian Melkart. This type of image draws heavily on Egyptian stylistic and compositional traits, such as the stance, the headgear, the kilt, which were already productive conventions, again, of divine or royal representation among the Canaanites and other Levantines. These Egyptianizing male figures, interpreted as divine or heroic in character, appear since the Bronze Age then and throughout the first millennium BC, engraved in metalwork and in ivories, while they were developed in stone sculpture in the Phoenician and Aramean realm only later on in the 6th century BC. But it is against this backdrop, sometime during the maybe late 7th century, that Greeks and Cypriots started experimenting with larger scale stone sculpture, as we see in the case of the Greek kouroi and in Cypriot male statuary flourishing at this time. These orientalizing sculptures were modeled on Levantine types, but probably mostly then on smaller portable arts or wooden statues that have now disappeared. And again, this is the backdrop in which we can situate the cultural perceptions of Herodotus or his sources and his own visual experience of archaic statues. In turn, female divine representations from the Levant and the Phoenician diaspora are less overtly or holistically Egyptianizing, although they do not lack for Egyptian conventions kind of mixed in with general Levantine features. This is even more evident, the Egyptian trait in small amulets. In any case, female images of the Astarte type circulated in Levantine art without discontinuity in the early first millennium. So they also provided models for Greek orientalizing adaptations in various media. So let's talk about those Greek adaptations. It is not difficult to imagine that the Phoenicians had something to do with this, the trickling in of Egyptianizing traits in Greek archaic art, but the channels and points of transmission remain elusive. More striking is the case of the kouroi, who have been long studied, but whose source of inspiration still puzzles scholars. Although there is no doubt that the Egyptianizing male statue type lies behind the Greek art form, the itinerary that the Near Eastern influence followed is still far from certain. Overall, input from the Phoenician or Cypro-Phoenician realm is more plausible than a direct Egyptian model traditionally assumed and associated with the presence of Greeks in the Egyptian delta, such as Naucratis. Indeed, it is on Cyprus where archaic male statues most directly represent the adaptations of Phoenician art in the Aegean. And these statues produce motifs, even color patterns, reproduce motifs and color patterns and styles familiar from Phoenician and Egyptian portable materials, contemporary and earlier, most likely including, again, wood materials that we have lost. In any case, these Egyptianizing Cypriot statues may offer a missing between the Phoenician statues and the Greek kouroi, although there is no consensus on that point, and I don't pretend to have the answer. It's my suggestion. It's a suggestion. Be that as it may, Greek speakers of the archaic and classical period were familiar with male, divine, or heroic figures that looked somewhat Egyptian. In the case of Phoenician or Cypro-Phoenician sculpture, quite ostensibly Egyptian, given the style, headdress and kilt, color pattern, decoration, and other attributes. So the Egyptianizing appearance of such statues would have been evident to anyone familiar with Egyptian culture, such as Herodotus. We find explicit articulations of this impression much later in Roman-era authors, especially Diodorus of Sicily, who draws on earlier sources when he transmits a story about an archaic wooden sculpture, or xoanon, of Apollo set up at Samos. The statue, according to the account that reached Diodorus, had been crafted in two exactly symmetrical halves and assembled at Samos by two famous brothers, a technique identified as foreign and especially Egyptian. As Diodorus states, this type of craftsmanship is not habitual practice at all among the Greeks, but takes place mostly among the Egyptians. A convoluted explanation follows about how this unusual sculptural work of assembly was possible only because of the perfect symmetry and fixed proportions of this type of hieratic statue. So the description matches the Kouros type exactly, and hence it is identified as Egyptian in type. John Boardman already argued that this specific passage by Diodorus reinforced modern scholarly readings of the Greek kouroi as Egyptian-inspired, therefore writing off the Phoenician possible element. But rather than continuing to look to the Egyptian materials only and ignoring the Phoenician images, my argument is that we should consider at least the Phoenician, Egyptian, and Greek elements as part of a cultural triangulation. In turn, female figures in the Aegean adopt a Phoenician/Syrian style. This style is often called Daedalic, right? Daedalic by art historians due to its first appearance on Crete, where the legendary, engineer, inventor was placed mythologically. It is telling that these types of crafts, especially engraved metalwork and embroidered textiles, are represented in Homer as typically Phoenician. In other words, Greek female figures of Daedalic or Orientalizing style follow Levantine cues that display a synthesis of various elements, Assyrian and Egyptian, Anatolian even, consistent with the type of eclecticism typical of Canaanite and Phoenician art. In the case of ivory carving, scholars have emphasized the distinction between Egyptian and Syrian inflections, even between North Syrian and South Syrian, but overall compositions featuring female figures find their closest reference in ivory and metal objects that are usually attributed to Phoenician craftsmanship. We can think of representations of the mistress of animals type or of archaic female figures seated or standing, sometimes adorning lintels of temples or serving as supports of stone basins, sort of as caryatids. Terracotta figures, also preserved but in less spectacular media, are equally important, a form of art of popular religious expression, and were also very clearly modeled on female Levantine models, like literally they used molds that came from that kind of art. So although Herodotus does not mention the Daedalic nor Phoenician statues in particular, he would have encountered Egyptianizing Phoenician statues when he visited the Phoenician coast, where their style remained quite stable into Persian and classical periods. The comparison would have been easy for him as he traveled in Egypt. And then in turn, he would also have seen Greek kouroi, also Egyptianizing, but distinctly naked, remaining among the 7th, 6th century offerings visible in his time. They represented deities, heroes, or devotees, it's hard to know, at places he very likely visited, such as Delphi or Olympia, or in locations where we know he lived, such as Samos, Athens, Thurii in southern Italy. And archaic feminine representations of Orientalizing style would have been visible in similar contexts. We have to think that places whose architecture Herodotus describes, even though he doesn't talk about the statues, such as the Samian Heraion, these places were the repositories of archaic votives of both types of divine representation, male and female, including wooden statues or xoana and scenes on ivory and metal objects. So while the dual strands of Phoenician artistic style, leaning more Syrian or more Egyptian, have been noted by art historians, especially for ivories, the correlation between the male and female divine statue types to narratives involving Phoenician gods, that is Egyptian or Syrian, has not been explored. Next, I bring forward some relevant testimonies that reflect the cultural backdrop within which these images were read by Greek or other external eyes. I argue that the artistic styles I discuss both formed and perpetuated impressions of cultural origins that had bearings on theological debates. So, when Herodotus was in Egypt, he learned that Heracles was recognized as one of the Egyptian 12 gods. But he says, about that other Heracles, the one whom the Greeks know, nowhere in Egypt was I able to hear about him. Herodotus argues that the Heracles known in Egypt must have lent the name to the Greek one rather than the other way around, as some Greeks thought. This reasoning matches his general view expressed later on the same excursus that, I quote, almost all the names of the gods came from Egypt, quote. Despite the cryptic allusion to names, whatever he meant by that, the fact is that in his Egyptian logos, the historian directs his attention to Egyptian ritual practices and their oddities, some of which involve the identification between other Greek and Egyptian gods, such as Zeus and Amun, Pan and Dionysus, and some Egyptian gods. I will return to this, but more importantly, we must notice that Herodotus' inquiry takes him next to Tyre. So he says, also wishing to obtain some clear knowledge about this, where it was possible, I sailed even to Tyre in Phoenicia, since I learned that there was on the spot a temple sacred to Heracles. Herodotus' route of inquiry shows that by his time, the merging of the so-called Egyptian Heracles and the Tyrian Melkart was well established, so that it was a natural move to pursue knowledge about this older figure in Phoenician centers or their presumed offshoots. But who was this Melkart? Just a note in case you're not that familiar. As a hypostasis of the storm god, Melkart is the city king and founding figure of Tyre. Traces of his cult can be found also across the Phoenician diaspora. He's attested in Iberia, Tunisia, Sardinia, Malta, Sicily, Ibiza, and the Aegean. Aspects of the god's mythological biographies cemented their overlap, especially their death by fire and afterlife associations. As a form of Baal, the figure of Melkart also inherited the monster-slaying narratives attached to the Canaanite god Baal, who fought the sea and death. Here you can see Baal on a smiting position. But it was the city founding and civilizing role that most inflected the assimilated Heracles Melkart figure as the Phoenicians expanded their networks. This quality was exploited by the expansive projects of Greeks in Magna Graecia, and especially by Romans and Carthaginians in the Western Mediterranean, all resorting to this hero god as they competed to tame the Western lands, just as Heracles tamed the Nemean lion or Kerberos and other monsters. It is against this background of identification and blending of features across the Mediterranean that we need to understand Herodotus and other historians' search for Heracles' origins, a background that definitely involves Phoenicians. But what does the historian find in Tyre? He went to ask, but he describes the impressive site of the famous temple of Melkart, with its two shining pillars made respectively of emerald and gold. This temple and the twin one that the Tyrians founded in Gadir at the other extreme of the Mediterranean and across the straits mark two axes of the Phoenician world. There is a strong symbolic association of these cultic marks with the pillars or stelae of Heracles as landmarks of the Western axis of Phoenician colonization. But all we learn about Herodotus' exchange with the priest is that it confirmed what the historian already suspected, that the worship of Heracles the god, the presumed Egyptian god, was as old as the foundation of the city, specifically 2,300 years before Herodotus' time. Hence, this Heracles, he confirmed, was much older than the Greek Heracles, son of Amphitryon and Alcmene in the Greek myths, in which the hero lived just before the Trojan War. So, seeking confirmation of these dual origins of Heracles and the Levantine external origins of the god, he followed the Phoenician trail to other places yet in the Aegean, where he or his sources believed the Phoenicians had been involved in the establishment of Greek temples to Heracles. So he went to Thebes, to Thera and Thasos, these two islands, and to Boeotian Thebes. Although there is no evidence to date of Phoenician foundations of the cult in any of these locations, it's interesting that some Greek traditions imagined Phoenician origins for certain cult places. The result of our historians' inquiry was that there was indeed a historical basis for the dual worship of Heracles, sometimes as an Olympian god, sometimes as a hero. Herodotus' testimony, therefore, is the first historiographical attestation of a theological debate already poetically expressed in the Odyssey, but only spelled out more fully by later authors, especially in Roman times. The ambivalent status of Heracles as a hero and a god was an oddity in Greek religion and mythology and caused a dissonance that triggers such a speculation about his double origins. The complex figure of Heracles matched a pattern much more at home in Near Eastern religions. He is indeed a heroic ancestor and god, the likes of Melkart, the city king god, whose death and return was celebrated in the annual rite of the Aegereses in Phoenician places. But the issue of the two versions of Heracles was particularly important for authors interested in universal and primeval history, such as Diodorus of Sicily. The 1st century BCE historian also reports that the Egyptians contended that this Heracles, their Egyptian Heracles, was much older than the Greek one. This old god, according to his information, had intervened in the cosmogonic Olympian struggles at the very beginning of time, which made him about 10,000 years older than the Greek pre-Trojan War Heracles. Diodorus also refutes the Greek etymology of the name of the hero from Hera and Kleos fame to insist on the full appropriation of the Egyptian older god's character and nomenclature by the Greek hero, so that, I quote, striving after the same purpose as that of the ancient Heracles, he inherited that one's fame along with the way he was called. That is, the Greek one inherited the Egyptian real, like older gods, attributes. Preceding his discussion of Heracles, Diodorus states that the Greeks are long believed to have appropriated the most famous Egyptian heroes and gods, and even their colonies that originated from them. This point is important for my argument, because Diodorus' narrative draws from the function of Heracles and Melkart as civilizing and founding figures tied to Greek and Phoenician colonization. So again, he jumps from Egyptian to really the Phoenician world. The historian's perspective is particularly relevant as that of a Sicilian scholar knowledgeable of Phoenician and Carthaginian culture in the central Mediterranean. In Diodorus' account, the hero's civilizing itinerary takes him through Libya, that is North Africa, crossing onto and subduing Iberia via the Phoenician metropolis of Cadiz, Gadeira, which is like right here, and physically binding or separating the two continents as he establishes his pillars, the rock and mountain which flank the Straits of Gibraltar at the western end of the Mediterranean. His journey in these lands therefore maps onto the Phoenician expansion and the expression of Melkart's worship in Western North Africa and Iberia. The pillars of Heracles were historically part of the Phoenician Carthaginian realms of influence until the Roman conquest, a process which is exactly the focus of Diodorus' narrative. The ways in which the Egyptian backdrop is confounded in historical scenarios of Greek and Phoenician interaction deserves a thorough study that I cannot provide here. But for now, my point is that the ancient debate about Heracles' origins shows that the figure was inseparable from these dynamics of Phoenician and Greek interaction, and also inseparable from concerns with chronological and cultural primacy that ensued as Hellenic speakers tried to integrate their mythical traditions with those of various other groups, both in the Eastern and the Western Mediterranean. So I have been arguing that Herodotus' Phoenician inquiry, both about an Egyptian Heracles, needs to be understood through the enduring relationship between Phoenician and Greek cultures, which was part of the Canaanite cultural matrix that the Phoenicians inherited and actively cultivated throughout their history. Of course, this is not the only instance in which Herodotus makes the Phoenicians the third party in Graeco-Egyptian entanglements. I can mention just one relevant one, which is when he proposes that the Greeks learned the rites of Dionysus, not from the Egyptians as others claimed, but from the Phoenicians of Tyre via Cadmos, who is the founder of the Thebes of Boeotia. This city is also the birthplace of Heracles. So basically the tradition about the Egyptian origins of both Heracles and Dionysus are entangled with this Cadmean foundation story of Thebes. Now, in contrast with the Greek identifications or interpretations on which most scholarship focuses, we're much more in the dark about what associations the Phoenicians themselves drew between their gods and Egyptian gods. While Astarte and Isis clearly shared attributes and representations, Egyptian associations with Baal and Melkart are more of a mystery. It is seldom noticed that both Dionysus and Melkart, but not Greek Heracles, were sometimes identified with Osiris, presumably as gods connected to the afterlife, but more pointedly to some types of rites, of mystery rites, and to wine. The Tyrian god possibly captured features of both kingly gods, Osiris and Horus, and perhaps in localized context of other gods such as Ptah, who was also associated with Osiris, or Shu or Khonshu. But leaving that aside, we should now return to iconography and the ancient perceptions of Phoenician religion as somehow Egyptian. So Greek speakers must have encountered Phoenician cultic places and images and noticed similarities with Egyptian features. Some at least would have stepped on areas of Greek settlement adjacent to Phoenician communities, such as in the Egyptian Delta or at harbors along the coast of Sicily, Crete, or Cyprus, or Iberia. Interactions in such contexts may have sparked the debate about Heracles' dual identity and origins. As I already noted, Herodotus' Historia often focuses on ritual actions he observed and at particular places. For instance, he was stricken with wonder at the monumental temple entrance at Tyre, as I mentioned, and he sometimes attaches anecdotes to stories and stories to particular artifacts. One such case is the story surrounding the twin brothers, Cleobis and Biton, whose statues were dedicated at Delphi, whether he was referring to these ones or not. Or the giant bronze cauldron with supporting male statues dedicated by Kolaios of Samos at the Samian Heraion. In any case, we can assume that he and other observers of religious phenomena were affected by the mode of representation of gods and heroes. But again, what did they see exactly? I briefly described this above, but there were two modes of representations of Melkart, Baal/Melkart. One in the Near Eastern tradition of the smiting god that I mentioned, more generally Egyptianizing, striding figure, and the other, the Hellenized types shared by, in the classical world. So the first type was used for a variety of male gods since the Bronze Age, these ones, Tarhun, Teshu, Baal, Horus, right? And Phoenician representations of these male gods continue in this tradition. The earliest representations marked as such epigraphically is on a stela from the Aramea milieu, this one in the center, harkening back to the Canaanite tradition best attested at Ugarit in this other stela of the Baal of lightning, now in the Louvre. Now, this iconography was still represented, you can see, in a stela from Syria from the 6th century BCE, closer to Herodotus' time. Here, Melkart, interestingly, is portrayed wearing the Atef crown of Osiris and standing on a lion, an image which lends itself to Heracles, kind of to a Heraclean interpretation. After a certain point, though, the Greek mode of representation shifted also as in the Phoenician realm itself, providing a new pan-Mediterranean style that masks cultural religious distinctions, but also facilitates cross-identification. We can just think of the representation of Herakles Melkart on coins, both on the Carthaginian, on Alexander the Great's coins and in the Carthaginian realm. So once again, we may look at Cyprus for the missing link. There existed a rich tradition of hieratic Egyptianizing statues there, and it is probable or possible that this archaic mode of representation contextualizes this identification. At a fundamental level, Greeks and Phoenicians coexisted on Cyprus since the early first millennium. Not surprisingly, the island is often suggested as a hypothetical scenario for the transmission of Near Eastern epic tropes and even for the adoption of the alphabet. But demographic proximity by itself does not explain the Egyptian associations of Melkart in Greek eyes. Cultic and iconographic cues must have played a role. Now, the equation between Heracles and Melkart, in turn, is probably the best documented case of interpretatio Graeca in antiquity. So we should talk a little bit about interpretatio. Corinne Bonnet is right in remarking that terms such as interpretatio and the more laden syncretism mask intellectually complex cognitive and cultural processes, not a simple or mechanical translation, blend, or collage. While emphasis has fallen more heavily upon written sources, I argue that images have played an important role in the reading of these processes, methodological difficulties notwithstanding. I mean, I'm not the only one to argue this, obviously. For instance, Maurizio Bettini has noted how external markers or insignia and sheer iconographic costume allowed for the recognition of divine statues in the Roman world as they were expanding. At the other end of the spectrum, the lack of clear attributes in a type of Phoenician and Punic terracotta, male figure protomae, masks, and other votives, as Adriano Orschinger has argued, may have allowed a fluid projection of various divine figures on a shared iconography in the Mediterranean. If we pay attention to passages where ancient historians deploy interpretatio or talk about religious transfer, it is clear that they emphasize ritual practice and materiality, and not, to our surprise, so much mythological or theological similarities. To insist a little bit on that point, if I may, perhaps we can follow anthropologist Webb Keane's invitation to put more weight on material practices and experiences than on beliefs or theological systems when it comes to the study of religions. In the case of cross-cultural transfer, it's especially relevant to think of how, and I quote him, religions may not always demand beliefs, but they will always involve material forms. It is in that materiality that they are part of experience and provoke responses, that they have public lives and enter into ongoing chains of causes and consequences, end of quote. The entanglements I am exploring here are precisely responses to material forms whose changes of context and viewers had consequences in historical and mythological interpretation. In the case of Melkart, Herakles Melkart, discussions have often focused on how to disentangle these layers of Phoenician and local traits from a Greco-Roman veneer extended in the classical and Hellenistic period. So generally, scholars have looked forward to the later periods. The iconographic and textual sources that I have discussed here, however, compel us to look also backwards to the earlier periods of Greek-Phoenician interaction. which are the centuries that Herodotus is peering into. Indeed, the idea of Melkart as Egyptian or Egyptian-looking god, I have argued, would have consolidated in the Archaic period when these statues were conspicuous, not only on Cyprus, but in other areas. The Melkart as Egyptian Heracles connection lingered, as did these types of statues, which would have had quite high visibility and traffic, even in classical times when Herodotus was traveling around. This hypothesis is supported and supplemented by a similar process pertaining to Aphrodite, whose mythological and iconographic trail also points to the Phoenician realm and to Cyprus. So I turn to that last section. Aphrodite and the Near Eastern love and prosperity goddesses, especially Isis and Ashtar, provide probably the other best documented cross-cultural identification in the ancient Mediterranean, as their cults spread throughout areas where Levantine and Greek populations overlapped. By way of clarification, I have to say that the Greek goddess Aphrodite does not appear associated with Heracles in Greek mythology, whereas by contrast, Astarte in the Levant was a consort or pair to the main god we have been discussing here, Baal or Melkart. End of parenthesis. So who was she in the Greek world? Just to, again, give a little bit of background, there's two variants of the divine genealogy of Aphrodite, reflected in the earliest epic traditions. She was a daughter of Zeus in the Iliad and the Homeric hymns, but she is born from Uranus, severed genitals without a mother in Hesiod's Theogony. Aphrodite is invoked as Urania by Herodotus and others, a title that signals Aphrodite's astral qualities and her birth from Uranus. But the title also brings Aphrodite close to the Near Eastern counterparts, as it was used for Phoenician divine figures, such as Astarte and Tanit, who are called Urania and Caelestis by the Greeks and Romans. Also, Near Eastern goddesses, such as Inanna, Istarte, Isis, Anat, received the title Queen of Heaven, probably also applied to Ashtar in the Hebrew Bible. In any case, unlike for Heracles, these coexisting versions of Aphrodite did not map onto a theory of dual origins or a theological dilemma, that is, hero versus god. Our testimonies seem to speak only of one Aphrodite with various epithets and aspects, not two later merged or confused, as it happens with the hero. But interestingly, also in the case of Aphrodite, we find Herodotus pointing to the Phoenicians as a source for religious innovation and cultural exchange. He postulates a Phoenician root to explain the introduction of Aphrodite from the Levant onto Greece. The context of this famous passage is the following. The Scythians plundered the famous old temple of heavenly Aphrodite, again here pointing to Ashtar, at Ashkelon, a city on coastal Israel. Herodotus situates Ascalon, in the part of Syria called Palestina. About the plundered temple, he says, "This is the oldest, as I have found after my inquiry of all the temples there are of this goddess. For even the temple in Cyprus originated from there, as the Cypriots themselves say." And regarding the one in Kythera, the island south of the Peloponnese, it was Phoenicians who founded it when they came from this same land of Syria. So note first that the Phoenician and Cypriot connection is drawn here once more to inquiries about temples and cult foundations, not mythology. In Aphrodite's literary portrayal too, her connection with Cyprus is very evident. Her epithets like Kypris, her birth story are linked to the island, also with ties to cultic aspects that are very Levantine, like incense burning and perfumed oils and all that. The Cypro-Phoenician connection is evident in Herodotus and provides a perfect foil for my argument about the possible role of Cyprus in the merging of Melkart and Heracles. But the question that puzzles me is, why does he specifically attach the label Syrian to Aphrodite? Astarte. First, the historian usually distinguishes between Phoenicians and other Levantines, but Syria serves as a broader geographical reference in the Levant, home of several Northwest Semitic groups that included Phoenicians and others outside Phoenicia, such as Judeans and a city like Ashkelon in Gaza, which nonetheless was inhabited by Phoenicians during the Persian period and during Herodotus' time. But the Syrian referent might be working at a more concrete way, perhaps at a ritual or mythological level. Herodotus may be the first attestation of a famous cult at Ashkelon of a goddess identified by the Greeks with Aphrodite. This divinity was strongly associated with the sea and the lion symbology and was known as Atargatis and Derketo in Roman times. This is the goddess often referred to as the Syrian goddess in the Levant and sometimes Syrian Aphrodite in the Greco-Roman milieu, best known perhaps from Lucian's the De Assyria. She is thought to have emerged from a Canaanite or Northwest Semitic figure, perhaps as a combination of Astarte and Anat. Aspects of her cult at Ashkelon are mentioned by Diodorus and others, including the sacred statues of doves, the bird, which is a bird associated with Aphrodite. Whatever the case, a Syrian field of reference seems to accompany Aphrodite and before her, Astarte. So for instance, Aphrodite is imagined dwelling either in Cyprus or in Syria or in Egypt in the Orphic hymn to Aphrodite. Again, these are sources from Roman times. And Cicero lists several versions of Venus, one of whom is from Syria and Cyprus and called Astarte. That's what Cicero says. It is difficult to put a finger on what Herodotus and others later on had in mind when they thought of Aphrodite's Eastern precedents. But again, the Syrian label, much as the Egyptian one for Heracles, seems to be at work, and it seems to operate at two levels. One on the mythological plane, where there are several threads to follow. First, Aphrodite is mapped onto Astarte-type goddesses, conceptualized as Syrian, as perhaps befits a broader Canaanite background. But just as in his narrative about Heracles, Herodotus moves from the more general association, Egypt or Syria, to a specific connection with Phoenicians. In this case, his leads invite him to postulate an adoption of the cult, not from Tyre, but from Ashkelon, where her cult was a famous one, just as the cult of Melkart was very important in Tyre. So perhaps he's following like famous temples. Finally, her trajectory through Cyprus agrees with the millenary cult of a local goddess on the island, the Cypriot goddess, that both Phoenicians and Greeks eventually identified with both Aphrodite and Astarte. But at the iconographic level, even if Herodotus does not reflect on stylistic matters, his route for Aphrodite works as a good match for the female representations of Astarte in Phoenician art writ large, falling under the general Syrian style. I won't get into that. In both cases, iconography, for Aphrodite and Heracles, iconography was not read in a vacuum, but against a background that included external perceptions of cultural affinity, as well as internal religious and symbolic relationships. Again, we can tell from the historians' attempts to explain away the identification among Greeks and other gods, visual cues, symbolic and ritual repertoires, and selected attributes, we can tell that all of that were as important as mythological or historical connections and genealogies. In fact, all these factors could confuse, modify, complicate, or override the neat mythological systems or equivalences that most ancient historians and modern authors try to pursue. In conclusion, in order to understand the Greeks' idea of an Egyptian Heracles, I have directed our gaze in the opposite chronological direction that we're usually led to argue that this interpretation of the figure connects with early manifestations of Phoenician divine images, whose Egyptianizing features were a constant into archaic and classical times, and even later. The early interactions of Greek and Phoenician speakers on Cyprus makes the island a possible nodal point for the assimilations of these gods and the myths of the Egyptian origins. More specifically, the archaic Cypriot hieratic male statues which find parallels across the Phoenician diaspora in other media too, were perhaps a clincher for the idea of an Egyptian origin of Heracles, Melkart. At a theological level too, Phoenician religion was deeply enmeshed in Egyptian symbology and mythology. The Phoenician representation of male gods and heroes was indeed in part Egyptian looking, not just in a superficial derivative way, but in their narratives, Greek and Roman authors sometimes eliminate the Phoenician component of these assimilations, sometimes acknowledge it, and sometimes articulate it by placing the Phoenicians as mediators in some aspect of their stories. Whatever the complex and long relations underlying these identifications, I have argued that in both cases, Egyptian Heracles and Syrian Aphrodite, the Greeks' experience of these Near Eastern counterparts to their gods was mediated by encounters with Phoenicians, their divine figures, and their ritual practices. Thank you very much. I leave it there. I can't hear you.
Thank you.
Anna.
Okay, thank you very much, Carolina. That was absolutely wonderful, and I'm sure that people will have lots of questions for you.
Should I stop the sharing or leave it to give the?
I don't know. I suppose we could keep it if you think that you might refer back to some pictures. I don't know. Could we? If people want to ask a question, obviously it's very nice if you can ask it face to face in your own voice, but we're happy as well, because obviously we know that some people are less comfortable speaking on Zoom. We're happy to have questions in the chat as well. So yes, I'll just open the floor then. Is there anyone with a question for our speaker? Yes, Jeremy Tanner.
We cannot hear you.
I think yes, that's better. Your microphone was muted. Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. Yeah, so what I wanted to ask was, I mean, first of all, for a kind of slight clarification of what you're arguing, because sometimes you talk about origins of Heracles, sometimes about this idea of entanglement, which implies slightly different ideas. So is the idea that Heracles is something that's, as a deity, is something who's picked up and created from Melkart in order to be able to articulate these ideas? Or is the idea that actually they had similar kinds of functions and roles so that they get assimilated to each other, which looks more like the entanglement? Is my first bit of it. And then I wanted to come to some questions about the role that material culture then plays, but it partly depends on the answer.
Right.
First.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. That's a key question. I'll be brief so then you can ask the other. I think in terms of historical development, we're talking about entanglement, not origins of Heracles, not Heracles, the Greek character or god created after Melkart. I think we don't know the origins of Heracles, and of course there are theories that say that he indeed is a god that comes from even Mesopotamia, maybe Nergal or something. There are all kinds of, but I don't think we can access that kind of deep information, and I don't think it's. I mean, I think it's interesting question, but I don't think we know. So I don't think the Greeks also knew. So they were just puzzled by the similarities, and they draw these connections, and then they were puzzled by these two natures. And I think, if anything, perhaps the entanglement, because of association of both figures not being the same originally, but may have added to the mythological story of Heracles, or even to the cult maybe there's influence of Phoenician in historical times from Phoenician or Canaanite culture, whereby he's also a god that dies and is divinized, or who knows, maybe there's something there that explains actually that duality of the character, but not the ultimate origins. So I think it's a matter of entanglement, to put it. And then the Greeks puzzle about the origin. So when I used origins, I was referring to the Greek perspective,
right?
not to mine, if that makes sense.
Got you. Okay, so that might partly address the kind of follow-up questions, but I kind of raise them anyway, which is, first of all, I'm thinking particularly about the role that material culture plays in this process. So, first of all, why should it be Heracles rather than any other deity that would be given this kind of Egyptian background based on the material culture and the kind of Phoenicianizing or Egyptianizing statues? And because pretty much every Greek deity in the archaic period, their initial iconography is as a kouros or a kore. So one would expect exactly the same kind of assimilation then to take place. That's the kind of first part of the material culture question. And the second one is more specifically related to what you were saying about perhaps it's the Cypro-Phoenician statues as being the model for the kouroi in the sense of the kind of classic kouroi type, so New York kouros and later, rather than Egypt. And part of the background to that was that you drew a contrast between the Aphrodite imagery, which you saw as being much more strongly indebted to, or very clearly indebted to, kind of Syrian traditions with the Daedalic types. But if you look at male statuary, also the earliest kind of male nudes and standing figures, and even some of the monumental ones, are actually Daedalic type. So there's then this kind of big break which happens with the emergence of what we think of as being the classic kouros, with the belt disappearing and with the monumentalization. And there's also a shift in terms of the material from limestone to marble. And by that date, we know that there was plenty of interactions between, with Greeks being present in Egypt. So, so it's got two things. One is the question about, why not every other deity, because they would also be seen in Egyptianizing or Egyptian types. And the second, the more specific question, or kind of doubts about the argument that you wanted to make about the classic kouros type as being perhaps indebted to Cypro-Phoenician rather than Egyptian.
Yeah, those are huge questions. I'll try to be brief. Let's say for Heracles, you're right. Why Heracles? I think it is precisely because of, I think that's why, the fact that it's Heracles that they insist on, and this itinerary of Herodotus looking for answers in the Phoenician realm suggests to me that he's seen as a special case of Near Easternization or something because of the Phoenician connection. I think that the Phoenician spread, let's say the Phoenician expansion in many places where the Greeks were also, exposed to it, made it easier or more tempting to focus on this figure because it was the main. I think it's what they're talking about when they talk about Egyptian Heracles. They are talking about about Melkart. That's the only way I can explain it. That they are and they are led by these Egyptianizing aspects of Phoenician religion and iconography, but they are attached to Melkart in particular. That's the main god in among the Phoenicians. They didn't have 1,000 gods as the Greeks do. So there's more of a focused, I think, cult, not exclusive, but more focused around Melkart in the Tyrian colonies. So I think that is why there is this focus on Heracles, because they're talking about that, kind of that synthesis, whatever, that identification in particular, that requires an explanation. But the others, yeah, I don't know, there's vague statements, right? Like the name, all the gods received something from Egypt. Whatever he meant by names is very, very strange. Possibly attributes, epithets, or features, or I don't know. So he has an idea that this may apply to others, but he and others later on, Diodorus and all that, they're clearly looking at the networks of Melkart, even as they are saying that he's Egyptian. They then go to the Phoenician realm and to talk about colonization, and they're clearly talking about that pair. So I think that's kind of a sort of an answer. About the Cypro-Phoenician status, I know I'm getting into very slippery territory, and I'm not an art historian. And probably art historians will hate me for daring to make these suggestions, but I make them with caution and knowing that, and only because they don't seem to know what the answer is. The ones that are the real art historians, right? I mean, it's very complicated, but what I want to do is just bring in the Phoenician element produces a sort of more muddy waters, which I think are important, because in those muddy waters is where this early sculpture in Greece emerged in contexts where, let's say in Crete, the strong presence of Levantines, very likely Phoenicians in early Crete around this time it's known, right? You don't have Egyptian colonies either, or Egyptian, maybe Egyptian people will be, maybe some contacts. Crete is close to Egypt, but there were Phoenicians there. So I know there are a lot of different possible factors and connections with Egypt and all that, but early on, there is certainly a connection with Levantine art that the Greeks knew when they have all the ivories in the Idaean cave and the metalwork and all that. That is of Levantine style. It's not strictly Egyptian. So all I want to do is kind of make a wedge and introduce that element. And I hope that others will figure it out with more precision than I can. I appreciate the question.
Not at all. Really interesting. Enjoyed that.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. I think we have a question from Amin Nasser.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Actually, I was born in, let's say, Phoenicia, modern-day Lebanon.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I can assure you that we can only find a very limited Phoenician temples, very limited. Instead, we can find more Roman and Greek temples and coins, especially on the Lebanese coast. Was it because the Phoenician were not a completed civilization, or only a naval civilization, or, as you prefer to call it, a seafaring people without any kind of materialistic ruins? They don't have temples, they don't have huge buildings, only small figurines, only small statues, etc. Even in mythological stories, we as children, we can only recall since childhood the story of Adonis and Ashtarte when he was killed by a wild boar near the Abraham River. Even when the National Museum of Beirut was built in the 20s, it was modeled on Egyptian style of architecture, not Phoenician style of architecture. Why? The question is why. And
thank you, Amir. That's a great question. So part of the problem, it's kind of a mirage. Like in part, it's because I mean, Iron Age archaeology, Iron Age remains are much less visible or easier to access, right? So because of the addiction and, let's say, admiration by Western culture of Roman and Greek remains, those are privileged in the archaeology. They're also the easy, the ones that are on top, so they're easier to access. So there is, you cannot make the temptation is to make an argument from silence. Oh, they did not have monumental architecture, because there's a big problem of just what has been dug and what has been appreciated and put in value. That has more to do with what Western cultures, want. So there's that problem. actually then the picture is changing, because there is been more excavations of Iron Age Phoenicia, and there are some sanctuaries like at Bustanashe. These are from Persian period, so a little bit later, but still, you know, relatively early, which show that they did have sanctuaries. They were not like the huge, you know, Roman temples or anything like that, but they had sanctuaries that, you know, were complex with their buildings and their altars and pools and stuff like that. In Sicily, like in the diaspora, they are excavating some sanctuaries, like on Sicily and Motia, right? Which is, again, we're talking about more humble remains because of the early period and the type of architecture, maybe, but not necessarily less complex or interesting, or perhaps even influential on Greek aspects of Greek culture. So I think the picture is changing a little bit. And then, as you said, still the visual, like the inertia from the West is to, even from in Lebanon itself, is to look towards Egypt because it's so spectacular, right? So when these museums are built in the earlier 20th century, of course, the point of reference is this Egyptian or Egyptianizing aesthetics, because they are much more attuned with Western, modernism, Art Deco, and all that, those tastes. But that also reflects Phoenician culture as well, because they were very Egyptomaniacs themselves, right? So it's kind of an interesting circle. But to your answer, I think, well, part of what my work and the work of many people working on Phoenician studies consists of is to rehabilitate, a little bit these earlier phases of Phoenician culture and say, well, there was much more than what we can see. And archaeology is actually advancing a lot and helping us reconstruct a much more, let's say, civilized and complex world of art and technologies and all that, beyond just seafaring and trade, which is the usual stereotype. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Amin. I think
Thank you so much.
Yes, okay. I think we have another question from Karen Bassi.
Hi, Carolina.
Hi, Karen.
Am I being heard?
Yes.
So wonderful to see you, and thank you so much for this enlightening talk. As you know, this is not my area of expertise by any means, but you mentioned in the talk the dual nature of Heracles. And I'd really like to know more about how this dual nature develops or is part of the argument about the Phoenician, let's say, intermediation between the Egyptians and the Greek figuration of Heracles. So does that dual nature of Heracles, is that part of this narrative, or does it get developed out of this narrative? I mean, obviously there's a triangulation you were talking about here, but that dual nature is a particular feature of Heracles. So I'd love to know what you think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you're in Gadir, a very Phoenician site. I'm very jealous. It's hard to. I mean, it's clear that by Herodotus' time, this dual nature is ingrained in the mythology of Heracles, and right that he gets apotheosized, and this apotheosis, he becomes an Olympian god, which is rare in Greek mythology or Greek religion, and in cult, like there is a cultic, I'm trying to put emphasis on materials and kind of cultic practices. So I think, Pausanias comments on it and others, mostly later sources, but we know from Herodotus that this is already an issue. So by his time, this is established and it's viewed as Greek by most people, except these ones where they are thinking about it like this is odd, and that are seeing these similarities with other gods, right? But where does that come from? So we don't know, but it is, as I said, it is more of an anomaly in Greek religion, whereas it is very Near Eastern-y, like as in the figure of Melkart, but also think of Adonis, Osiris. I mean, there are these gods that are both gods and characters that die and come back, therefore, could be read as mortal heroes on the one hand, that then become gods. So there's something in the figure of Heracles that seems to possibly, I mean, this is hypothetically, maybe have absorbed or even come already with whatever he originated, with this element being kind of a Levantine trait that really belongs more in Near Eastern figures. But since we cannot access the actual origins of the figure, it's hard to tell. But there is something about it. There is something about this duality that is really, I think, Near Eastern in a sense, and that in Greek myth is articulated as he's a demigod, he lives in this period, and then he becomes an Olympian god. But there is this kind of odd duality in cult as well. Like apparently in some places he's like he has a cult hero, a hero cult type of cult, and then in others as a god. So yeah, so I don't know what else. I don't think we can know for sure, but I think that is a trait of the Levant. I think that's and the Greeks are trying to make sense of it, and actually they get pretty close because they're looking for it in Phoenicia. So so it kind of makes sense, but we don't know how, when that happened, or if it was an original feature of the figure or something that was, I don't know, incorporated, but definitely earlier than centuries, probably before Homer, right? Because Homer already signals that. So we're talking about, who knows, maybe even the Bronze Age. I don't know. We don't know. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a fantastic a fantastic example of cultural translation, I suppose, because I mean the whole, I mean, apart from Dionysus, I suppose the Greeks don't really have a dying god of their own.
Right.
He's a very peculiar kind of dying god. I mean, he's born twice. It's not a sort of cyclical renewing thing. I mean, the whole business in Homer with the eidolon and everything is just an example of the contortions, I suppose, that they have to put themselves to even to comprehend this notion, because their categories are so strict so early, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And that's, it's not a coincidence too that Dionysus precisely is another god. I think among all the gods, both Heracles and Dionysus are the ones that are more strongly associated with the Near East, and they seek their origins, possibly, you know, as I said, Herodotus thinks that Dionysus, the cult at least, also comes from the Phoenicians, which is like, what is he thinking about? Which god? We don't know. It's not, I mean, he's not being accurate exactly, but that they're tempted to look into Egypt and to look into the Levant for explanations of these aspects, precisely because Dionysus also dies and come back. He's associated with mysteries that have to do with the afterlife. So very much like there is actually a whole narrative in Herodotus about Osiris and connections with Dionysus, the Dionysus cult as a secret, as a secretive thing he cannot get into. So we're talking about, kind of mystery narratives. So we're missing part of the picture, but both of them, I think precisely because of that feature of dying and being connected with the afterlife, they both make these historians look down to Egypt and the Levant, the Phoenician world. So really bizarre.
Yeah. We have Sonia Brenches. You have a question?
Yes, indeed, I do. Thank you very much for this interesting talk. I'm a historian of science, so very far from all of you, but we are doing at the Max Planck Institute since a couple of years a project on, let's say, the distribution of astral knowledge from very early on across Eurasia. And that's why I'm here, because I wanted to hear what you think about these cultural mergers, these entanglements and transfers. So I learned quite a bit. My question is, among the material that you study, is there anything that would be of help to us, as any connection in the iconographic realm about either the heavens as a whole or as on partial constellations or individual stars, or any other kind of cosmological or astral connection beyond the very interesting reference to the goddesses of the heavens that you made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Sonia. I'm not an expert on astral things, and it gets very, kind of complicated, and I get lost very quickly. But Astarte and also Aphrodite and Venus, so all of these goddesses were connected to the star, like possibly the Ishtar herself in Mesopotamia, right? I mean, that's is the morning star or the evening star. So there is an astral component of this type of goddess that seems to be shared in the Mediterranean, and the goddesses are also, this goddess and her different incarnations is a protector of sailors, right, because of astral guidance. And also Baal and Melkart seem to be as a god of colonization as well and expansion. They both seem to be protectors of sailors and so on. So they have, they are part of that life of looking for guidance in the stars and all that. And in the case of Baal, I think you will enjoy a recent article by Lorenzo Nigro in Antiquity, the journal Antiquity, about this sanctuary, Phoenician sanctuary and Motia on Sicily, where he argues, I mean, it's a very interesting argument. I don't know if it's correct or not, it is not correct, but it is definitely very interesting that there is this pool, and he argues that the pool, the water reflection will be used for astral kind of mapping of the movements of the stars. Whatever the case, you have there references to the association of the god Baal and Astarte to the stars and cycles, because they are gods of life and regeneration, life and death, the afterlife. So they're all tied to ideas of time, cycles, and those ideas are always tied to the cycles of the, of the sun, of the moon, and the stars, and so on. So there are connections there that you can explore. If you don't find the article, write me an email, and I can send it to you, and maybe if I can think of anything else. But yeah, there might be some interesting things there.
Right, thank you very much. I was thinking more whether Egyptian constellations, for instance, were part of these Egyptianizing elements, or whether that is not at all in the iconography theme. So among the Egyptian style iconography that the Phoenicians incorporate, they do incorporate astral iconography, especially Horus, right? The solar disk and the winged disk. So they adopt some of the Egyptian symbols that are astral, that are connected to Egyptian gods. So Horus as the sun, he's the god of, connected to kingship as well, right? And a lot of the iconography the Phoenicians has to do with, kind of kingship symbols, and then protective symbols. For Astarte, it also appears a lot, the moon and the sun and rosettes, which are taken as stars. And that comes from the iconography of Ishtar again. But these symbols appear connected to Astarte and Tanit, the Carthaginian goddess. So a half moon and solar disk, and eightfold, little rosettes that can be read as stars as well. So there is some of that. Thanks. I will write to you and will ask you for some references.
Yeah. Okay,
sure.
Thank you. Yes, Joachim Clark.
Yeah, hello. And I would just like to take up this last question about the astral symbols, because in the material Carolina López-Ruiz showed to us, there is at least one very obvious instance of Egyptian astral iconography. It was this amulet where you had the solar child on the lotus, and next to it there was the bull's leg with the 7 stars.
Sorry, long PowerPoint. I know what I think you're...
Yeah, exactly that one, thanks. So here you have the solar child on the lotus, and then you have the bull And I think the markings are probably for the 7 stars. And this is the Egyptian constellation of Mesech-Tiu, which more or less corresponds to nowadays Big Dipper. And there is even actually one late period Egyptian amulet charm preserved in a papyrus now at the Brooklyn Museum under study by Yvan Germer, which, if I remember rightly, invokes this solar child together with this constellation. So this at least is one rather clear influence.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. I hope that Sonia took a note of that. Yeah, so here you can see again the very Egyptian, obviously an Egyptian iconography with the solar disk, of baby Horus, the lotus flower associated with Isis and Astarte as sign of life. Here you can see other, even the baboons associated also with the sun, and Isis nurturing baby Horus and stuff like that. So they really went for this type of Egyptian iconography that had nonetheless strong, they had clearly absorbed it as part of the iconography of Astarte as a protector. And in this amulet, you have the Phoenician inscription to clear doubt that it's not Phoenician, at least in use, that with a formula protect, guard, and protect, which appears in Phoenician amulets, Shamar and Natsar, which is really, really nice. And other symbols, maybe another astral thing. Yeah, I really like that. So this is the Big Dipper, you think? Or what is this? It's a flat plant, or? I don't know. I have an article about this. I don't remember what they said.
It's depicted as a bull's leg, and the Egyptians had this constellation of the bull's leg with 7 stars. And the markings you have here on the amulet more or less correspond to the positions of these 7 stars.
Right. Very nice. I might write to you to ask you for a reference for that.
Yeah, feel welcome to contact me.
Okay, thank you.
I will do the same. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course, also welcome.
There is another thing that that appears in Phoenician amulets is the decans. And Egyptologists here know more about the decans than I do, but they portray the decans but they use them in amulets, which is weird because the Egyptians don't seem to use the decans on amulets. So again, they adopt Egyptian things, but for their own use.
Yeah, well, actually, I studied the decans in my habilitation thesis, which unfortunately is still unpublished, but I have a long chapter there on the iconography of this particular family, and there are some parallels on the Egyptian side for the use in amulet. Half of them unpublished or just published those very last months.
Okay, I will write to you because that puzzles me a lot. And again, I think that they adopt certain motifs that mean more to them, like in any cultural transmission, right? You adopt symbols and type of iconography that speaks to you. And I think the Phoenicians had a kind of big obsession with time cycles and renewal, and the decans kind of mean that the passage of the year. Anyway, it's very thank you. Interesting.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Do we have any other questions? Well, if not, then perhaps we should allow Carolina a well-deserved rest after her Heraklean Ponoi. So it was a very exciting paper. I feel I've learned a lot and had perspectives opened, and I think everyone feels that way. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you all for your attention and your questions and input. Yeah.
And we'll be reconvening as the Graeco-Aegyptiaca seminar will be reconvening towards the end of May. We'll be in touch about that in a few days' time. And of course, the recording of this talk will be available online on the palladion.hu website. Anyway, thank you very much, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.